our next guests on stage to get mic'd up. I just wanted to share a small thing that kind of hit me while I was listening to Gulzar Saab. So he said that, the form of poetry that he writes, it's because he wants the word to spread, not go into textbooks, right? And it reminded me of a quote by Rumi where he says, raise your words, not voice, right? Raise your words, not voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. So I think poetry is something like that. It's important to find your voice and then just give it out, let it out into the open so people can consume the words that you create. So I would like to welcome on stage in just a couple of minutes, once again, for the session, the corporate bard, Nadir Godrej with Barnali Shukla. Let's hear it for them, folks.
A fact to follow. Yeah, but thank you for being with us. The sofa.
Okay, fine.
Okay. So, Amuta, I guess, so the introductions with me. I am Barnali. Hi. Thank you, organizers and all of Bangalore for, this is a 60% house. It's not so bad. Okay, so
Once they're finished with Gulzar sir, they'll be back.
Okay. Before, I guess, talking too much, we'll let his work talk. And I've chosen a poet from his collection to introduce, Mr. Nadir Godrej. And I think, sir, you don't have a question which is asked to you normally that you're a poet, but what's your day job? So here is an industrialist poet. So this is written by him. It's his bios, which comes in a poem form. The poet, a player of chess, bridge, and Scrabble, and manufacturer of soap. In languages he's known to dabble, with 6 he manages to cope. An engineer he's by profession, but poetry is his obsession. The poet, Shri Nadir Godrej, has reached 65 years of age. St. Xavier's, both the school and college, MIT and Harvard in the Bay State, and Stanford by the Golden Gate are fountains whence sprang forth his knowledge. And here he'll speak of many things, but not of cabbages and kings. We've had a lot of talk of kings, I think, just now. So yeah, that's the man. I don't know how you can fit this person on an A4 page. So it's lovely to have this conversation. Thanks to the Poetry Festival that we met. We live in Bombay. We use so many things which are Godrej. But lovely meeting you, sir.
Great to meet you, Barnali.
Thank you. So, like I call this, the synergy of chemical engineering and meeting the DNA specialist, Dr. Hargovind Khurana. I have a biology background, so I'm sorry I'm a bit skewed there. And an industrialist, a father of 3, a husband and brother to the Adi Godrej. All this, the confluence into making who you are. How do you draw upon each of these faculties?
I've always been very interested in science, though my main science, sorry Barnali, was chemistry, but we always call chemistry the central science, sitting squarely between physics and biology.
Okay, so it's best of both worlds.
So I feel comfortable in all 3 sciences being from the central science. And I always had a scientific temper of mind, very logical person, always despised bad thinking, and was so appreciative of Gulzar Saab, pointing out what kinds of bad thinking is happening sometimes.
So it was really liberating, actually, as what writers today, we are being muzzled. So,
Yes.
It has freed.
And mostly I make speeches in verse, so that's why it's easy for me to combine different facets of my life. I always like to do different things, and when I started making speeches in verse, I found that people rather enjoyed it is very different from the normal speech.
Yeah.
And that's why I continued.
So he tells us that, when, as an industrialist businessman, when he is supposed to, address an audience, it was always in rhyme. Is that right? And people really look forward to that with gray suits and, trying to be politically correct. Here was a man who brought so much of musicality to it. Is that right?
That's right. And when you say harsh things in poetry, it always is a little gentler.
Okay, thank you. So you've written across the spectrum, of what little time I got to go through your wonderful work. So it's been the Indian economy, to relationships, to your travel, to actually chemistry, which talks of fatty acids. So is there an area which you think you've not visited?
I'm sure there are areas which I've not visited, and I've probably not visited areas which most poets visit. Okay. But I've visited lots of areas which poets don't visit.
Yeah, so which would be that? Should we read something from there which
Sure.
you suggest? So maybe.
What should I read now? Maui?
Yeah. So this is, I think, with the flow of his visiting and travelogues. This is
Yes.
a travel poem, I think I would like to call it.
This was a travel poem that I wrote many years ago when I was in Hawaii. And it's entitled Maui. A crooked line has traced the fate of the wandering Pacific plate as it traverses a hot spot, creating islands dot by dot. And Maui was the one we chose, and there before us 2 humps rose. Maui, you see, is still intact. She's very young and still well stacked. Kukui now will slowly shrink as land below begins to sink. Haleakala, on the fringe of the hotspot, can have a binge. And someday soon the central plain will be submerged by sea and rain. By helicopter we saw sights beyond imagination's flights. Over the crater we did fly, where Pele the goddess once did ply her fiery show across the sky, upstaging any 4th of July. But then we saw a soothing scene, pillars of water framed in green. Kahulawe, Lanai, Molokai majestically rose in the sky, and down below Molokini, the bottom half of a bikini, for those who look with a lecherous eye at half a crater from the sky, encompassing so many treasures, so full of palpitating pleasures, for those who bravely choose to strive, for those who swim and those who dive. Was it the sea or firmament that put us in our element, or should we blame the crazy moon for putting us in such a swoon, and for the many wondrous fashions in which we pandered to our passions?
Thank you. So, Nadir, if I can ask you this question, I see a little twinkle in your eye suddenly, and it's one of your inspired work and not the prosaic choices. So, a very traditional question. How and when did poetry happen to a person like you? You're actually dressed in gray, no way.
Poetry, a little bit when I was a student.
Okay,
And my grandmother was a poet, and more importantly, she used to love to recite poetry. My mother often wrote occasional poetry. She would always write our birthday cards as poems. So I sort of got into the habit, but didn't write much. Then in the mid-80s, I met some people who belonged to a strange missionary sect, and I wanted to contradict some of their views, and I decided to do it in poetry form. And after that, I started writing, and shortly thereafter, I made my first speech in verse, and that happened to be in Calcutta, and it was merely a vote of thanks, but they were so surprised to see a vote of thanks as a poem, and they enjoyed it so much, and I have to thank Calcutta for encouraging me. Then I was studying Russian, and Russian is one of my 6 languages. It was probably the rustiest of the 6. And my Russian teacher said it was Pushkin's anniversary, and she wanted me to speak at it. And she said that Nissim Ezekiel was going to be the chief guest. I was one of the student representatives. So I had just read an article in Span about the influence of Pushkin on Vikram Seth. And Vikram Seth had just published Golden Gate, which, as you know, is all in Pushkin sonnets. So I wrote my speech in Pushkin sonnets, describing the connection between Pushkin and Vikram Seth, and Nissim Ezekiel rather enjoyed it. And after that, I decided to write more and more poetry, though unfortunately, mostly speeches in verse.
Interesting anecdotal points, sir. Do you want to read the poem of
The influence of
the which
Pushkin
resonances? Not the influences we'll get to later, but I think your
the poem about Vikram
on
Seth?
Vikram.
The influence of Pushkin on Vikram Seth? Okay. Had I not written one short letter in which I mentioned Vikram Seth, perhaps it would have been much better for those of you with little faith in my admittedly poor talent. But some amongst you who are gallant and choose to lend at least 1 year, in cadence verse you shall all hear how Russia's scion, Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, wrote in verse, tetrameter, supple, terse, now flows, then ebbs, there's nothing grander, about his great protagonist, Eugene Onegin, amorist. His early verses were erotic, but then he wrote about revolt. The Tsarist times were quite despotic, and Pushkin was then forced to bolt to country home where isolation served as a source of inspiration. At court, he leads his later life, but now he has a charming wife. Alas, she leads him to perdition, as she falls for Baron Dantes, and Pushkin feels he's forced to press a challenge and uphold tradition. His line comes back to haunt him now, the bloom has withered on the bough. Where came the poet's inspiration? This child of Russia borrowed well. A debt was owed the British nation. Lord Byron's touch, we all can tell. Since Pushkin's rhymes are quite audacious, the flowing rhythm always gracious, and frequently asides are heard, as well as many a foreign word. Verse novels are a strange invention. What skill to write in verse like prose, and still ensures it smoothly flows. Courageously he flouts convention. We cannot classify his style. Sometimes he's sad, then for a while he's funny, or he's idealistic. For Pushkin, there's no pigeonhole. At times he's earthly, folk simplistic. Escaping genres is his goal. To classic ideals he won't grovel. Instead, like Byron, a free novel is what our poet has in mind, and freedom is just what we find. There is no cause to be pedantic and claim like some he wrote to rule or followed the romantic school. To him, plain freedom means romantic. Apparently he had a doubt about the way it would turn out. Some credit for this extravaganza is partly Jean de La Fontaine's, for he inspired this lovely stanza, a couplet after 3 quatrains. And I, for one, would bet upon it that it is by far the sweetest sonnet. With La Fontaine, it was but chance, but Pushkin made a new advance. His is a regular formation, with both a male and female rhyme, arranged quite differently each time. Variety in permutation, slow start, fast spin, while in between, at end, the resolution's seen. You may well ask, what's the connection? One day while Vikram Seth did browse, amongst the bookstore's wide selection, diverse translations did arouse his curiosity. He has stated, in Russian he's not educated, so he decided he'd compare and see how both of them would fare. And one he found he was just reading, page after page without a rest. No doubt he thought it was the best. And which translation was succeeding? Charles Johnston's one. There was no doubt, as you, dear reader, have found out. It is now time for a description of Vikram Seth, which I could write, but I do feel his own inscription might be best for me to cite. This is a quotation of Vikram Seth. In 52, born in Calcutta, 8 pounds 1 ounce was heard to utter. First rhymes, cat-mat at the age of 3, a student of demography and economics he has written. From Heaven Lake, a travel book based on a journey he once took through Xinjiang and Tibet, unbeaten at last by wanderlust and rhyme, he keeps specific standard time. At times a poet needs a mentor, so Vikram Seth was wont to feel. In search a shared room he did enter, and quite by chance he found Tim Steele, a happy choice, for they could rattle of reams of rhyme, no idle prattle, but preparation for writing verse. This is why Tim Steele did nurse in Vikram Seth the skill of rhyming, iambic meter perfectly, and other tricks of poetry. Such was his luck, so good his timing, he found the very friend he'd need. His dedication, now I read. It continues, but I think I'll stop here.
So you need some water.
And thanks.
That was, it continues, yeah?
And I later met Tim Steele, and he wrote a book called Missing Measures. And he was pushing for poets to use traditional styles, and he thought that was important for him. And I have stuck to that.
Yeah, that would be, I think we were leading to that question.
Yes, so I might as since I talked about Tim Steele, I thought I'd talk about that. I enjoy that. And I think before the invention of prose, everything was written in verse, because before writing, there was no other way of recording things. Verse is easier to memorize. So instinctively, all of us seem to enjoy that. Now we have prose, now we can read novels, we have the written word, we have the computer, we are overwhelmed by data, but I think our hearts still crave poetry.
Yeah. See, there are more for this school of thought. So, I mean, given that...
Let all schools flourish.
Yeah. Given Bangalore, and we have a direct association with the techies here, and there must be a lot of geek poets here. I was just curious that has the association of pure science, has that affinity affected or seeing a pattern or a structure, apart from the fact that you say that rhyme is easier to remember? So would you, Einstein played the violin and he was a scientist. So there have been cases like that. So do you think, when you say even the male and the female sonnets here.
Right.
So do you think we can illustrate in any way how the geeks don't need to lose heart?
Yes, I think the one way, though I met Tim Steele many years ago, shortly after writing this poem. Yeah, I'll put it down. I met Vikram Seth recently, about 2 years ago, and I met him at one literary fest, and then he came down to Mumbai for another literary fest, and he visited us as Vikroli, and I wrote a poem of introduction, and I spent a whole day taking him around Bombay, and before that we exchanged mathematical puzzles. I was very surprised to find that he's very fascinated by mathematics. He was doing his PhD in economics when he wrote Golden Gate and changed his career. And of course, he's fluent in Chinese, and he's traveled to China, as I mentioned, and he's translated Chinese poets. He is also a polymath, and I found a great connection to him, exchanged mathematical puzzles with him. And he also pointed out that in the Pushkin sonnet, each of the quatrains have a different rhyming scheme. A, B, B, A, B, A, B, and A, B, B, A, and then the couplet at the end. And as he pointed out, that's all the combinations you can have of two rhymes in a verse in a stanza of 4 lines. Meter definitely has mathematics in it. And the Pushkin sonnet has all these combinations as well. There's a strong connection, as you pointed out, between music and mathematics.
Which is that octave thing again?
Yes, music, of course, has all the physics of sound in it, and therefore it is a very mathematical process. Part of the reason is that all these traditional forms tend to be rigid, and so it's quite understandable that poets want to escape them. But I think it's a good idea to know the rules that you want to escape.
Yes, totally. Okay, so while it's quite easy for us to see your influences of contemporary work of Vikram and Steele, but are there other influences which you would talk about?
Yes, so Vikram is, of course, the most contemporary influence, and I think Byron, Pushkin, Shelley, some French poets, Baudelaire, even Victor Hugo, who is not so well known as a poet, but I rather enjoy his French poetry. And once he had a pun in 2 lines, completely different spellings, but exact pronunciation for a whole sentence. A pun that goes across a whole sentence. So I enjoy wordplay. That's why I like Prévert a lot, or Victor Hugo indulges in a lot of wordplay. And funny poets, Lewis Carroll.
Of course.
And Ogden Nash. One of my favorites of Ogden Nash, and whenever I go to London and I go to St. James Park and I see the pelicans, I always remember his lines. A wonderful bird is the pelican. His beak can hold more than his bellycan. I wonder how the helican.
Yeah, we so need it. Yeah. So, considering that here is someone who knows 6 languages, and are you partial to any? And B, the second part of the question being, there are a lot of people who say that you write in the language you think. So, you want to take the question separately?
I think I'll take both those questions together. The language I find the most fun is French. And in the 80s, I wrote a few French poems. And I will read a poem which shows my various connections to France. I'll come to that at the end of this. And it's funnily enough, when I was learning French, to get more and more fluent, I would watch movies, I would read magazines, and I would carry imaginary conversations in French. One day, it was a sad day, it was my grandmother had passed away, and I wanted to write a poem. And it was sad, but she was 96, so it was not all that sad. And I actually decided to write a poem about near-death experiences. And I tried to write the poem in English, and it didn't work. And then I started in French, and it seemed to work. So I think it's necessary to think in the language in which you write in, but it's entirely possible to think in 2 languages. And today at lunch, I met the gentleman who takes photographs and writes haikus about the photographs. I think they're displayed outside. And he told me that his first language was Malayalam. Then he switched to English, and he writes now only in English. But he wants to write in Malayalam again, but he wants to start thinking in Malayalam before he writes in Malayalam. So I fully get that. But I think it's possible to think in 2 languages and write in 2 languages. Sure, Pavan Verma can write in 2 languages. Yeah. Any translator can write in 2 languages. Jerry Pinto can write in 2 languages. And I've stopped writing in French, but I really enjoyed the period when I wrote in French. I'm not going to read a French poem, but I'll read a poem. By the way, this is a picture of me with Vikram Seth on that day when I met him and took him around Bombay. So this poem was written on the day I received the Légion d'honneur. I'm the president of the Alliance Française, involved in other French associations. And so they awarded me the Légion d'honneur. In the process, they saved my life, because I received this award on November 26th, the day of the Mumbai attacks.
The bombings.
I had 2 invitations at the Taj, one at the Oberoi, both of which I declined. My previous French award, the French asked me to choose a venue, and I'd chosen the Taj for that venue. But this time they were having a Cordon Bleu festival, and there was going to be a Cordon Bleu dinner after the award, and that was going to happen at the Four Seasons. So fortunately, I was at the Four Seasons on that day. I'm very grateful to France for saving my life.
Saving your life.
And this is the speech I made on that occasion. Although some elements are new, I have this sense of déjà vu. 6 years ago, I was awed when I received my first award. I don't quite know for what feat I got the Ordre du Mérite. And now it's the Légion d'honneur. Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. This love for French and for France was a coup de foudre from first glance. My very first link, I now guess, was an early visit by GS. My mother wrote that when I was just 2, ma cousine Genoise conversed with me en français and left an impression till this day. Perhaps that is the reason why in school I would always try so very hard when it came to French, but Hindi felt like a wrench. In 70, by happenstance, GS invited me to France. So I was quickly on a plane, and then I took a rumbling train. The train was slow, no TGV, but soon I was in Saint-Tropez. The beauties there gave me a scare, for most of them were rather bare. And very soon I came to know why this small town was called Saint-Tro. Of course, I met a comely wench who taught me how to speak in French. For those who don't know, Saint-Tro means big breasts. At school, you mostly read and write, so speaking French was a delight, and thus began my link to France. For my role in IFTA and Alliance, Uncle Sora paved the way. I sorely miss him on this day. His absence is the only cloud. Today I know he would be proud. Like me, he also had the chance to be decorated twice by France. My family is here in full force. For me, they've always been a source of great support, as I recall. And I would like to thank them all. My friends, thanks for the bonhomie. Join us in French gastronomy, paired tonight with Indian wines. These are good auguries and signs for ever stronger collaboration between great France and our nation. My thanks then to Monsieur Rouault for putting on such a show, and in the coming weeks, Alliance will bring you all the best of France. For joie de vivre, France is known, a concept that it seems to own. But I think it only fair. France should be known for savoir-faire. And if I could have my way, we'd travel here by TGV. France and India could win the race in voyaging to outer space. Both countries could successfully develop nuclear energy. I'm deeply grateful to Jérôme, who traveled from his home and kindly came all the way to our beautiful Bombay to present me with this award. With all our hearts, let's applaud. I'm glad that I have had the chance to share with you my love of France. And some of you might well find this somewhat strange, but love is blind. And so I would like to quote from a poem that I once wrote. Mais mon cœur ne me donne le luxe du choix. Je ne sais pas pourquoi, mais j'aime ces Gaulois.
I'm curious. It's a simple question I'm thinking for you, but I think a lot of us would want to know that, how your day, does the bard or the board, whenever there's a tussle, if any, or is there any time of the day or place which you find yourself being drawn to? Because here is something that you're addressing a group of people, or you're going for a speech, or you're giving proxy for a brother who's not landed up for a speech, and you tend to write this on a deadline.
Yes.
And there are others which are inspired works, like the one with Roxanne, you need to read out to them.
Okay.
But how do you manage that, or
Yes.
do you or don't you?
Yes. So when I have a speech to make, there's a date for the speech, there's a deadline, and I feel like a journalist. So I write in the car, or I write in the plane, or I write early in the morning. I don't like writing late in the evening. But for the better poems, what happens is I wake up in the middle of the night, suddenly get some ideas. When I wrote L'Amour, I suddenly started thinking in French in the middle of the night and writing the poem. Or I wrote a poem about my uncle. I woke up in the middle of the night and started writing the poem. So that's a time for inspiration. The subconscious always writes better than the conscious.
Yes, it does. Yeah. So, can we read the...
Roxanne?
Yes.
Right.
So, and you must tell us about how you led to writing this poem.
Yes. Roxanne was a very dear friend of mine. She was married to Darshan Shah, who's still a very good friend. But unfortunately, she died in a car accident 25 years ago, almost exactly 25 years ago. Roxanne, you were our daily dream. Your light, a powerful, steady beam. Our little group you organized, and your soirees were always prized. And now we have all lost the light, and Darshan's in a sorry plight. The boys do not quite comprehend that their dear mom no more will spend the slightest time with them again. Tears well up in the strongest men, the sister brothers all bereft, the parents and both grandmas left unnaturally for you to grieve. Roxanne, Roxanne, why did you leave? I have no fitting words to tell. I'll be content with just farewell. Alas, you were denied last rites by stupid men and petty fights, their resolutions banning towers, the tragedies not yours but ours. None can deny eternal life to such a precious friend and wife. The memories of this short stint will blaze away in thoughts in print. And as your soul in peace departs, we must live on with wounded hearts.
Thank you. So, of these so many hats that you wear, would you want to divulge which is your favorite?
Actually, my favorite hat is...
There are feeds straight going to your Vikroli office.
My favorite hat to wear is that of a polymath. I like to juggle all my hats.
And you've been really doing it well. I mean, so many of us want to be there, and I'm sure there'll be questions outside.
Yes.
So what would you want to be remembered as?
Exactly that.
The polymath.
Someone who does, who enjoyed lots of things. As you can see, I write about different subjects.
Yes.
Chemistry, of course, and economics, and politics sometimes.
And religion.
And
because
religion.
I think the earlier
I'm a little
segment...
skeptical about religion, especially very dogmatic religion. And I always like to quote Philip Appelman, who said, make the bad people good and the good people nice. I really wish the good people were nice.
And I think the last question, I think, because we are not doing too good on time and you have a flight to catch and you're ditching the poetry festival, okay? Is there an ode to our times, let's not talk religion or whatever, but the one where you speak of Europe reborn in the times of Brexit, and I think where divisions and borders are becoming so evident?
Yes.
So I like the way you sign it off with a paranoia, which we all ought to have.
But remember, this poem was written in the late 80s.
And it resonates. We'll see if it resonates.
Soviet Union was collapsing.
Please be frank. Yes.
A continent ripe for revision. The zephyr blew the western sands. But so complete was the division, a mist stood on the eastern lands. Ideology appeared the barrier, with radio waves the only carrier that could transcend the prison wall, enough to make the ramparts fall. And so we cheered at first in Warsaw, and then, of course, in Budapest. The tyrants fall in Bucharest, for Prague and Havel even more so. So can we now be of good cheer and lay to rest at last our fear? Divided Europe so pacific, amazed historians all these years. But now that freedom is prolific, Once more we hear the ancient fears. All are concerned about the Germans, and furtively are preached the sermons, as no one dares say it aloud. But undercurrents in the crowd of newly free and greater powers just go to show that some are scared. Old border issues might be bad. We may be faced with nuclear showers. This freedom, can't it be enjoyed? Must I be quite so paranoid?
You must be. Thank you. So how are we?
I think we should go to questions.
Yeah, I think so. So any questions? There I see a lady. Do we need the...
Rich, there was a statement that you made about you can break the rules in poetry, but be aware of what you're doing. In earlier sessions, there was some criticism from one of the audience who spoke about all the poets writing in blank verse and saying, I think poetry is completely gone out of our lives. So what would you have to say? Because your poetry is all in verse and rhyme.
Exactly, and I enjoy doing that, to do what they like to do, but I think it's also nice to know the whole history of poetry. And to some extent, it's natural. The invention of writing, in a sense, destroyed traditional poetry, because you needed that to memorize. Now we don't need to memorize. So I think we should accept all points of views, but we should be aware of all points of views.
Not. There was some kind of reference that maybe government hadn't sponsored the arts the way it should be, and Dr. Amjad Ali was a little bit disparaging about that. But don't you feel that today the corporate culture is actually stifling and stifling freedom of thought and expression?
I hope not. And I'm not sure we should have a lot of government support, but many countries do have government support. Government support can also be stifling because it can direct you in one direction. And we as a corporate are trying to do quite a bit. We have our Godrej Culture Lab, and we welcome all of you to interact with that. It's open to the public, and we showcase a lot of culture. And not just we show films, but we always have a discussion of the film. Or if we have a theater performance, we have a discussion with the director and the actors. So I think corporates can support culture more effectively than the government, and perhaps with slightly less of an axe to grind.
I'm Ravi Shankar speaking. May I know your writing tips for people who work for the corporate sector? So, in terms of so that they may be able to express themselves.
One tip is to try and make speeches in verse, and look at the history of poetry. Yes. Thank you very much, everybody. Oh, and I have a website, nadirgodrej.com, where all my poems are posted. Sure, come. Thank you, Barnali.
All right, so we started early in the morning, spoke about languages transcending, or rather words transcending and moving on to poetry. Today we heard some French, and I heard a lot of people clapping. I don't know if we got it, but I think we did, regardless of whether we understood French or not. So that's the beauty about poetry.